Hello and welcome to Cultural Economy in the Kitchen, the podcast from the Journal of Cultural Economy's editorial collective. I'm Professor Philip Roscoe, Professor of Management at the University of St Andrews Business School, and I'm co-editor-in-chief of the JCE.
And I'm Dr. Addie McGowan, Research Associate in Market Studies at Salford Business School at the University of Salford, and Reviews and Online Content Editor for the Journal.
Today is all about when climate meets finance. It's a cultural economy love story, kind of. We'll be joined by Dr. Stine Engen and Professor Kristin Asdal discussing the politics of climate risk and how the climate issue is turned into a risk issue through the little tools and operations of finance.
And then we'll turn the conversation to Dr. Justin Leifso's piece, How Dare They? Neoliberal Resentment and Carbon Taxes in Alberta, Canada. We think these papers together show two very different but really interesting approaches to understanding how finance is enrolled, or not, in our response to the climate crisis.
So let's introduce our guest. Stine, can you introduce yourself and tell us where you're joining from?
Sure. So I'm Stine Engen, and I'm a lecturer at the Center for Technology, Innovation and Culture at the University of Oslo, and I am joining you from Oslo. So now it's getting dark outside here, and it's quite snowy.
And what's your research interests?
So I recently finished my thesis on climate risk. So my research interest fits very nicely within the theme of this podcast. So finance and climate change and different ways of economic solutions to climate problems.
And
Nice.
that's marvellous. And the important question, because it can't, yes, indeed, sorry, congratulations, because it can't all be academic stuff. What have you been cooking lately?
What have I been cooking lately? I don't know, different things. I would like to go skiing soon if I can, but it's going to start raining now, so we'll see if it works out.
Nice. And Kristin, can you please introduce yourself and tell us where you're calling from? Joining from, that was an old radio hangover.
No, I'm actually also calling from Oslo. I'm a colleague of Stine at the TIC Center for Technology, Innovation and Culture, and I'm a professor in science and technology studies, and also trained as an economic historian. And throughout my career, I've been working on the relations between nature, environmental issues, and economics in different ways. So I'm completely, it's very, very interesting now for me to see how finance is turning, well, if not environmental, so at least relating very strongly to the environmental issue, while it used to be more kind of what I usually call the classical, neoclassical economists who had their particular ways of going about environmental issues. So now they have got some competition.
Right. Nice. And what have you been cooking in your kitchen lately?
Oh, in the kitchen, the real kitchen, I'm a terribly bad cook. Actually, I have to confess, we've started to kind of order some pre-cooked stuff in order to get some proper food in the kitchen. So, I've been cooking very, very little, and so I'm very good at dealing with pre-cooked stuff and to finish that. So. And as with Stine says, we don't cook now these days. We are just out skiing, right?
Out skiing.
Yeah, I think I took your question a bit too metaphorically. I, of course, do cook a lot.
Do you? I didn't know.
We love a metaphorical answer, so don't worry.
You'll be interested to hear that we've just recorded an episode on digital eating, because we've just had a nice special issue out in the journal on digital eating. So for those of us who order in, which I don't, I actually cook real food when I know what else seems to. I do, yes. It's really fascinating. It's a really interesting thing. Justin, tell us about yourself.
I'm Justin Leifso. I'm from Treaty 4 Territory, Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan originally. I am now an assistant professor at the University of Victoria in Victoria, British Columbia, Canada, on the territories of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples. My research is, I follow my nose with my research. I will say that I have three very broad, loosely defined interests. One is identities and discourses of oil and energy. The second is neoliberalism, broadly construed in all sorts of different places. So those two sort of interests are what brought me to the paper that I'll be discussing today. And the third is the production and construction of Western Canada through capitalism neoliberalism and colonialism. So very, very happy to be here. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And it's early in the morning for you as well, so extra brownie points on
yeah, well, it's getting dark.
answer.
It's getting dark in Oslo, but it's actually still dark in Victoria. I can see a tiny bit. It might be a little bit later, but I might be
We are
thinking
in the northern part of the northern hemisphere, as T.S. Eliot once wrote. It's always dark in January. Right, let's get into it.
All right. So Stine and Kristin, thanks so much for your paper all about exploring the politics of climate risk as they are made via financialization. Can you first give us a bit of background on this research and maybe what inspired this work?
Sure. I can go first. The paper is about climate risk, as you said, which is a relatively new phenomenon, something which has gained kind of a larger political or economic significant in recent years. It kind of developed in the 2010s in kind of an intersection between climate groups and financial actors. And often in the literature, this moment where Mark Carney, who was then governor of the Bank of England and who is now actually the Prime Minister of Canada, he gave a speech where he talked about this notion of climate risk, which is often brought out in the literature as something that made this notion more well-known in wider circles. So intuitively, this notion of, I think when you hear climate risk, you think that it's risk to the climate or to the environment, but what it actually means or refers to is financial risk. So the financial risk of climate change. So the potential devaluing of financial assets in the future because of climate change, which is often also called stranded assets. So like it's that the assets will no longer gain profit, but will be stranded. The finance sector has been important in defining this. So it has been studied also as kind of an abstract idea or a concept. But what we were interested in our work, was to look more into how it's being understood and worked on in practice by financial actors. And then we did these interviews. I did my PhD as part of a project which Kristin was leading, and we did a lot of interviews together. And then this paper comes out of these interviews where we wanted to understand how these actors worked on it in practice. We were given access to specific empirical material that turned out to be quite interesting, we thought, in terms of studying it.
Nice. And so then, Kristin, it sounds like this is a part of a broader project that you're leading. So what got you interested in this work, and what was the hook into these questions that you had?
Yeah, the project that I'm leading is called Value Trends. So it's very much about valuation practices. How is it that nature, the environment, is made valuable, so to speak, and very often that is in finance and economics more broadly. It's about kind of putting a price on nature. So we are very concretely interested in how is it, what are these practices through which one can value by very often pricing nature. So that is kind of the broader interest, but the broader interest is also related to what Stine just mentioned, that when it comes to climate finance, it has come into place in a way by finance people, but also with a lot of hope and investments by environmentalists. So there is a very interesting kind of merger and a kind of hope that if finance gets involved in the climate issue, then something might eventually happen. And in a way, that's quite different from what it used to be, because environmentalists have very often been very critical towards economics and economist ways of approaching environmental issues. And also in part because they have, to a large part, failed. Economists have not been as successful in pricing nature as they kind of, even if they are very kind of idealistic in theory about the possibilities of doing that in practice, but in practice they have often been failing. So climate finance is another way of approaching the climate issue, which is actually quite different from standard neoclassical economics. And I think it's very interesting to explore, investigate those differences. And because we often tend to think that the economic is one thing, but it's what I tend to call, there are versions of economization, there are versions, different ways in which nature becomes economized. And so climate finance is one way in which this is being pursued and sought to be done.
So can we just drill down a little bit more into this idea of risk? Because it's a really kind of crucial and complicated idea, and not everyone who's listening or watching will necessarily have your expertise. There's the crucial distinction between climate change and climate risk. But you've talked about investigations into how things are accorded value, and in a sense, risk is the worry that things that already have value will cease to have value, or that they need to be discounted in some way, or what have you. And also, risk is how finance makes its money, isn't it? You know, risk is what you do when you say, you shout across the trading floor, I need some more beta or whatever it is, alpha or whatever it is you shout. You're talking about, I don't know, I'm just making this up. You talk about risk. So tell us a bit more about risk and climate and exactly what's going on in this transformation. Stine.
Yeah, so I completely agree. And this point was actually something that I found very interested in this notion of climate risk, is that through the social sciences there has been a large focus on risk as something negative, like a threat, whereas the financial idea of risk is a lot more I could say nuanced, but it's a lot more ambivalent, because it's not only about something negative, it's also about being able to manage this in a way so that it's not a threat, but actually a way to make a profit. And so that was one of the things that I found very interesting about this. And so you could say, so the whole idea behind this risk is kind of based on that we need to have a transition happening, and so money needs to be moved from what we don't need in the transition to, or from high carbon to lower carbon, and then risk is kind of meant to be the incentive that kind of moves assets in this way. From a threat. So if you make some things a threat and some things opportunities, then money will kind of shift. That's the basic idea. And something we also talk about in the paper is that this risk is also commonly separated, which the actors we interviewed also make use of this separation between something called transition risk and physical risk. And physical risk is the risk also to financial assets, but that coming from weather changes or physical changes to the climate that could devalue assets. But transition risk is about the risk of climate policy. So the financial risk that climate policy or other types of regulations will come in and devalue financial assets. So it has a very from the kind of intuitive idea you maybe have when you first hear the notion of climate risk, it is a lot more complicated or paradoxical than that.
Yeah, and I think if I could add something to that, because when you think about this thing, which is transition risk, it's about a risk that the transition is happening too slow, but it's also the risk that it might happen too quick. So it's very much about trying to manage and stabilize things, and what this stabilization is very important for. It's not necessarily so much the climate, but finance, so that there are in a way stable conditions for finance. And so the transition risk, and that's also why our paper is about the politics, we say, of climate risk, because ultimately it is very much about politics and policy, the ways in which policy decides to act upon the climate issue. And so in a sense, politics becomes a risk to finance. If they move kind of in ways that might risk kind of devaluing assets, as Stine mentioned.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so then ground us a bit more in this context of politics and I guess the timescales also of this work. So what was going on with that task force of climate-related financial disclosures, or the TCFD, which I know, Stine, you kind of mentioned sort of in the beginning. And then what was your interest in that? What followed? And why did that matter to this notion of climate risk that we're talking about?
Yeah, so we kind of, as I said in the beginning, we started this work based on the interviews that we did with some Norwegian actors. So we were allowed to, retrospectively, we're allowed to access to a lot of document material from Finance Norway, who is the main organization of the Norwegian financial sector, who had made a roadmap for the Norwegian financial sector's role in the green transition. And then we were given access to both, I mean, this final roadmap is public, but then we were also given access to a lot of draft material and PowerPoints and different things that were used in the process of constructing this roadmap. So that is where the TCFD came to stand out, was that from reading these documents, you could kind of see an issue forming throughout the process, where it was organized a bit around this notion of climate risk. And then the specific framing of this risk came from reports from the TCFD, who had handed in their final report in approximately the same time as this roadmap process began.
And I think that in a way, the way we try to handle this in our research, I think this relates quite a lot to our background in science and technology studies, in the sense that we very often tend to see kind of economics as something quite abstract, that's some kind of ideas or models or whatever. But what we try to show is how these kind of financial ideas very concretely are translated into practice by way of quite kind of material, small little tools. Right? So the PowerPoints and this roadmap acts as a kind of a little tool through which financial ideas are becoming realized in practice, and also not only realized, but also made movable from Finance Norway into the Norwegian government, actually. So it's also a very kind of concrete way of following this realization of climate risk through material objects and how they move to become policy, and as part, actually in our case, become part of governmental budgets, actually.
Right. Yeah. And I love that really STS kind of method of tracing. So really tracing the notion of climate risk, how it moved between the financial sector and the government, and how this enabled you to articulate the financial risk can arise from climate policy, kind of that main point that you're making. And then that risk threatens the stability of the entire financial system as a whole too, which becomes then an important issue for the government to watch. So speaking of financialization, can you expand a bit on how you define it and how it was a useful concept for you in this work?
Yeah, so financialization, as listeners of this podcast will probably be aware, is quite extensive.
Yeah.
And it's used mostly to describe a kind of grand shift. So a shift from like industrial capitalism to financial capitalism. And but it has also been employed in a more, we could say, STS-y ways, focused on like the tools that are used to make this happen, and smaller practices and valuation as well, how financial valuation is creeping into more and more sectors. So, for example, also policy. And that is kind of the literature on financialization that we have built on in our paper, and then tried to link this through to the study of documents to see maybe documents could also then be a tool of financialization in this sense. So not only, what you think of maybe as more classical financial tools, but reports. And this is also something we found interesting based on our interviews and the work we did with financial actors, is that they work a lot with documents. It's a very, very document heavy sector. There's so many reports, extreme amounts of PowerPoints, so it's not only, I don't know if people have that idea that everything is very technical, but there is a lot of document work going on as well.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely fascinating to see how I mean, in the case of Justin's paper, which we'll get to in a second, we're in a sort of more familiar territory that people are regulating. You know, they're doing policy and stuff like that. But this is institutional process manifested in, I presume, a roadmap is really a collection of PowerPoints and reports, and that, you know, it's a stack of paper or digital paper or what have you. And yet these whole issues of global futures are coordinated around, as you say, these little things. And does anyone notice? You know, do we see this process happening as citizens or?
No, this is a very good point. I don't think we very often we think of them as so mundane that we don't even start noticing them. We don't have always we are not so well equipped, I think, to notice them always. And also the actors don't talk so much about them either. So it's a kind of more we as researchers who are trained and curious about these little tools, and so can see how they matter. But I tend to think that it's quite important that we notice them. It's also a way of showing that these are very concrete practices, and they can be done in different ways. And it's a way of opening up economics as a field. Also, it's not something that is simply imposing itself upon the world or kind of completely taken over and must, so to speak. It happens also in ways that we can both interrogate, and they can also, the roadmaps can go into different ways. It's not a given, the ways in which economics work. And it's also a relational affair. So that is maybe our take also on financialization, at least what we try, is to show that it's not simply finance taken over, it's also relational, it's also a struggle. How is it that kind of the environmental issue also works upon finance? So it's not completely a one-way procedure.
Right.
I also thought.
Go ahead.
No, sorry. It was just something that it's not an explicit part of the paper, but something I've been thinking about after is that in some social sciences you have a very strong idea of the state, and then you have kind of the private sector. And I think what this also shows is that this divide is in practice sometimes a bit more loose, that these political processes happen in conversation or in dialogue between a lot of different actors who would fit into different categories if we thought about that politics is like the state and the private sector does business, which I think also is interesting.
Right.
Guilty as charged from political science's perspective.
Good.
Well, I mean, what's your take on this roadmap, Justin?
I'm just going to say first of all that I love this paper, Stine and Kristin. One of the other things that my PhD was about bureaucracy, and I have done work on what we call the politics of the mundane with respect to colonialism. But I really loved the tracing of the documents, and in particular, I thought that Addie and Philip, that was just putting our papers together, was so clever, because you have, I think, this account of how something like climate risk is articulated, is constructed, and then made governable through technocratic, mundane technologies. And then my paper talks about how those sorts of technocratic, expertise-driven processes are rejected or can be rejected.
Yeah, and we really want to tease that out, and as we in the end we'll get your take on that, because these two, I think, show something similar in very different ways and kind of really speak to this political moment that we're in more broadly. But we'll invite you each to comment on that as we wrap up. So, Philip, do you want to?
Absolutely. I'll pick up and grill Justin about his paper for you, because it's really interesting, as you say. Your paper kind of begins where this one leaves off, with an elite group making a bunch of decisions that are then contested, and I really enjoyed it when this came across the desk the first time, because I've always thought of neoliberalism as a fairy tale, in a sense. You know, you have Milton Friedman with his pencil going, "It is the magic of the price mechanism that can get this into the store for 50 cents where you need it," and it's like, ooh, you know, this is and it's heavily moralized and so forth, but I've never thought of it as a sort of politics of resentment before, which is what you draw our attention to, and it's very, very interesting. But tell us a little. I think we need a little bit of background. You know, what's the context and the inspiration for this paper? What's special about Alberta? You know, just lead us in gently as to why you're interested in that.
Alberta is the primary energy producing province in Canada. It is where the vast majority of oil and natural gas are extracted. A lot of that from the 1940s to the 1990s was conventional crude from southern Alberta, pump jacks and oil derricks and that sort of thing. Now it is tar sands, right? Bitumen. And it is also, perhaps correspondingly, the most conservative province in Canada. And we have to keep in mind that Canada has a very decentralized federal system. And I did my PhD at the University of Alberta. I'm very much a Western Canadian from the prairies. I'm from neighboring Saskatchewan. And so I was doing my PhD when a couple of things happened where the Liberal Party of Canada, now led by Mark Carney, who is very strangely tying our papers together again.
The ubiquitous Mark Carney.
Right. When Justin Trudeau won the Liberal, the Liberals under Justin Trudeau won the 2015 general election federally, and very, very importantly, the New Democratic Party, the NDP, which is the ostensibly Social Democratic Party, won the provincial election in Alberta, which was a wild development because the Conservatives had been in power for 40 years. And independently of one another, but sort of related, they both honed in on climate change and in particular greenhouse gas emissions with respect to the energy sector as part of their platforms. And I'm not going to get into the specifics of Canada's carbon tax regime, which is now largely dead. But a system was put into place wherein a price was put on consumer carbon emissions. So, taxes on gas or petrol or heating of homes through natural gas, electricity, all sorts of things. Very much a technocratic, neoliberal sort of approach to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, right? You put a price on things, it internalizes the externalities of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. We all go about our ways as rational, self-interested individuals, and we make better decisions about how we heat our homes, how we travel, all those sorts of things, and greenhouse gas emissions fall. But I was in Alberta when this was happening, and people got really angry about it. And that didn't surprise me so much for a number of reasons. But the curious thing was I kept watching very rational, I would say very small L liberal policy experts and elites trying to lecture angry Twitter trolls about what you just talked about, Philip, trying to lecture them about the price mechanism and how, oh no, this is actually going to make things cheaper because there's offsets and all these sorts of things. And it was like trying to calmly, rationally explain the world to this angry mob. And it just, and they were absolutely confused as to why it wasn't working. So that was this puzzle I had. And then I spent 2 or 3 years constructing an elaborate sort of theoretical way of thinking about it using affect and emotions and neoliberalism. If somebody wants, a simple, straightforward, parsimonious explanation for this, they're probably going to be disappointed in this paper.
This is not an economics podcast. You don't have to do parsimony. We can handle complexity and depth.
Yeah, and so I came up, and I realized that also because I've been teaching a seminar for 5 years now about the sort of theoretical and political project of neoliberalism, that there's actually the emotions that I was seeing in response to neoliberal technocratic expertise-driven policy was not that dissimilar from the emotions related to sort of anti-elitist sentiment and resentment that was actually present in neoliberal thinkers themselves. And so I, went back, and this is kind of something that people have been doing lately, is going back and excavating the work of Hayek and Mises and Friedman and others that were sort of involved in the Mont Pelerin Society and other sorts of nodes in that network, and pointing, and I found that it wasn't just that, they were arguing that planners couldn't possibly understand everything about the world to make rational choices, and thus you should leave it to the market. It was that they were also telling people that those rational bureaucrats that were trying to do that were trying to tell them how to live their lives. And there was, like you said, a sort of moral argument against that. And it came clear as I was doing this analysis that the same sort of emotional response to carbon taxes was now sort of attacking the neoliberal expert-driven consensus in a way that neoliberal resentment attacked the Keynesian planning consensus.
Let's before we get to the empirics, in a sense, let's linger on neoliberal resentment a moment longer, because it is so fascinating, and I just love saying those words. But I was going to ask who the elites were, and who the elites that are being anti-elited, and you've explained very nicely. It's kind of policymakers and liberal thinkers, university people, all of those economists, all of those kind of group. But in the origins of neoliberalism, Hayek has a chair in King's College, Cambridge. Friedman is at the University of Chicago, the one of the intellectual hubs of the world. I mean, these are not non-elite people, are they? So it's a particularly strange sort of intra-elite complaint that Hayek is having with his good pal Maynard Keynes, who is also at King's and got him there in the first place. It's a very peculiar kind of wrangle.
Fair enough, but at the same time, they were marginalized within the discipline.
Yes,
and I think I know that Hayek resented, because you can go and watch interviews in the late 1970s where he's sort of starting to do his victory lap, where he's like, I was ignored for so long, and now people are finally figuring it out. But the other thing is, if you read, his work on, socialism and the intellectuals, and he starts off with being like, well, this socialist stuff, it's not a working class thing. It's all of these, Fabian intellectual elites. So, he's constructing a sort of binary between himself as this outsider and then the actual elites.
So it's academic sour grapes, which is a much more plausible intellectual history, isn't it? And
indeed,
then it rolls. Yeah, fantastic. So it rolls then into the kind of arguments that you discovered empirically. So tell us about that.
So it was pretty straightforward, really. I went through, and I don't necessarily recommend this, every news article, every letter to the editor, speeches from Hansard, the official record within the Legislative Assembly from, I can't remember exactly which years, but from a number of years in Alberta. So we're talking the two major dailies in that province, Edmonton Journal and the Calgary Herald, but also small weekly newspapers from much smaller communities. And so I went through and did sort of a inductive coding where I just looked for emotions. I'd looked for affects and found just this anti-elitist resentment that resembled very much, and of course, much less sophisticated terms, the sort of thing that had been articulated by Hayek and Mises and Friedman and the others. And it, that's when the paper sort of really started coming together and be like, this is the same. First of all, we have to stop thinking about neoliberalism as this sort of just purely rational thing. It is a number of different, sometimes contradictory things, but its ascendance depended on an emotional appeal. When Ronald Reagan, got up and said that government is not the solution, it's the problem. Well, it's not like we're all sitting around being like, yes, on balance, that sounds like a reasonable thing to say. No, there's an emotional appeal. These things were they were skillfully operationalized by, the politicians of the day, the charismatic politicians of the day, Reagan and Thatcher and otherwise, in a way that, again, was worked to destabilize the elite consensus of the day, which had been sort of rational Keynesian, technocratic Keynesian economics.
So what kind of tropes are being invoked? You give some examples in the paper.
A great deal of them had to do with how dare they, right? That's what the title of the paper is, like, how dare they try to tell you what to do? Because I would point out that, again, these sort of angry responses would just sort of be mad at the idea of taxes broadly, which fair enough. But then they would be again lectured by these liberal elites about the price mechanism. But they caught on to that. They figured it out. They actually understood that they were being subjected to behavioral sciences per sort of rationalized understandings of human nature. And they resented it, and they started talking about, well, no, you're attacking our way of life. You're telling us that, for example, driving our kids to hockey practice in the middle of the night, which is something that legitimately happens all the time in the Canadian West, that is somehow bad. You're trying to limit that. And you think that you know better than us about how to live our lives. And they actually honed in, I think, quite specifically on that, this idea that their behavior was trying to be manipulated by these eggheads who thought that they knew better than they did.
Yeah, so why do you think then that emotions have been overlooked in studies of neoliberalism? I mean, to me, this was a big light bulb moment reading this work, especially when compared to its kind of rational and technocratic dimensions. I think this is fascinating.
In one sense, I mean, if you think of how neoliberalism is studied as a concept, there's two sort of broad, loosely defined schools, right? You have political economists and sort of policy studies people who are going to take themselves kind of a rationalist approach, kind of a foundational ontology to sort of looking at these policies and studying their effects. The other one, the post-structuralists, so they also, I would argue, focus primarily on the logics of, and understanding the logics of how neoliberalism is understood to operate, neoliberal policy is understood to operate. And I've already sort of thrown my discipline under the bus once with, Stine's very acute and insightful observation that we have this tendency of carving out the state as this separate thing. The other thing that political science is really, really bad at is dealing with anything that has to do with emotions. And it's because this discipline, my discipline, has very much been invested in studying the political as an arena, right? Whether that arena be the state itself or the electoral arena, that is the thing versus a process of governance. And I think that in that case, that's something that we haven't focused on, And I think that something like neoliberalism, in the social sciences, even not necessarily just political science, we focus so much on understanding those logics and the arguments that are being made, and undervalue the emotional resonance. That is something that exists outside the political, despite the fact that my students know that politics is political, because when I tell it, they all nod very enthusiastically. And for whatever reason, even the more critical scholarship out there hasn't really dealt with this, because when I went out to try to engage with the scholarship, it was pretty sparse. It's Anderson and a few others, and now me.
Yeah, and so I guess the question then, and then we'll open it up, but for me, and this is not my area of expertise, but I'm very fascinated by it, is that, like, where does this leave today's neoliberal? And for me, as an American living in the UK, this is making me wonder if neoliberalism maybe all along has been almost like a Trojan horse for a certain type of political intervention, called hands off, the market will fix it, kind of ironically. And drawing parallels with my own home government, the GOP always standing for small government, but now imposing the biggest government maybe we've ever seen in the United States. So anyways, I would love your take on that, and then we'll kind of wrap up and bring everyone back in together.
I mean, we are now at this place where the people who are looking at sort of neoliberal policymaking are coming to terms with the question that you were asking. It's not just the United States. There's all sorts of like far right populist movements. We were very, very close to having a very populist sort of nationalist government here.
Yeah.
If it weren't for Donald Trump threatening our sovereignty and Justin Trudeau stepping down and Mark Carney taking his place, we probably would have had it just all around the world. And so a lot of scholars have really been thinking, okay, where does neoliberalism, is it done, right? Is that our particular articulation of the neoliberal consensus done? And I think, yes, to be quite frankly, I think it is. But then the process now, and I think this is what this paper was really me struggling to figure out how to do, is then how do you trace the things that were present during the sort of heyday of neoliberal governance? Which one of those are cast off? And I think it's the sort of trust in liberal elites' expertise. That's one of the things that's going to be left in the dustbin. But then what stays? And it seems to me that some sort of faith in the market, valorization of the businessman. I mean, that's one of the things that Trump used to sell himself. Those are things that perhaps could stay. A demonization of government, even if, like you said, contradictorily, it might actually not be much smaller at all, but people have been tracing that for a long time, roll out neoliberalism and that sort of thing.
So what we can see, thanks Justin, that's fantastic. What we can see across these papers, both of them, is the deployment of these different kind of languages, really, and these different sorts of expertise and figures, different technical devices and understandings of risk and freedom and tax and goodness knows what else. Where does this leave us? Who's responsible, accountable for sustainable finance at the end of all of this? It's very unclear to me, having read these papers. Stine,
well, and the first, I should say really quickly, the first thing that Mark Carney did when he became the leader of the Liberal Party was get rid of the consumer carbon tax. The night that he became the leader of the Liberal Party, he said it's done. So I don't know.
So the former governor of the Bank of England and the inventor of climate risk, or the tragedy of the horizon, that was his thing. But there we are. Stine.
I think so. Who's responsible? I agree with you that it's very dispersed, the responsibility, or that might be quite unclear who actually is even taking action at this point. But one thing that struck me reading your paper, Justin, was that what kind of differences these two political interventions are. So even if a carbon tax is kind of you call it like a neoliberal market way, it's still like a quite direct intervention because you're taxing people. And compared to climate risk, the climate risk is like, it kind of feels like the hope that lies behind this risk notion is that you won't actually have to do politics, because you can say that you have the ambition to do politics in the future, and then that will be calculated as risk, and then that will be sufficient. So kind of like the future signaling of politics more than actual political intervention, which I think maybe is also quite interesting related to like the theme of cultural economy. So like the work that is done then on these expectations into the future. So I don't really have a good answer to that other than that, but that I feel like climate risk is even more removed from doing regulatory changes, although it was also part of this backlash that happened, especially in the US, on woke capitalism and which I guess is also a theme in the sustainable finance.
Yeah.
Just to follow up on that, I think actually it's quite interesting, at least, to see climate finance as something very different from the market approach of using taxes. And if we were to, in hindsight, when we now see climate risk emerging and finance emerging as a kind of actor in the field of the climate issue, then I tend, in a way, to see more kind of not positively, but maybe to see more what was actually what the neoclassical economists, the standard neoclassical economists were trying to do. And they were actually very differently from climate finance, seeing from the state, because the taxes were actually tried, and that's why it became so difficult. They were established by way of the state, by regulatory mechanism. It was called always a market mechanism, but of course it never were. It was state regulations that were, there were procedures, and very, very heavy procedures, political procedures, to put taxes into place. And that is why they almost never came into realization, because they were so controversial all the time. Already from the very start, when the ministers of finance were trying to establish taxes from within the Ministry of Finance, at least speaking for the Norwegian case. So they have always kind of and in that sense, I think it's super interesting what you're arguing, Justin, in the sense that they've always been surrounded by controversy. It's been a very, very controversial procedure. And I think it's extremely fascinating now, by way of the role of finance, that it's money now which is supposed to be solving the problem. Whereas for neoclassical economists, there was always a reluctance to use money. That you should always use only sufficient amount of money. And that's why you also turn to taxes, because the government should not use money on regulatory measures, but rather it was to be kind of paid by the actors. So it's a very different approach to money, actually, and to funds. And I think that's a super important thing to notice. So the role of the actor is also very different, I would say, with these two versions of economization.
If I could really quick
fantastic,
jump in.
Thank you. And that's a wonderful place to wrap up the observation that, sorry, Justin, I'm watching the clock. The observation that money's the root of all solutions to everything. I think we should stop there. As I promised you, it's a cultural economy love story, kind of, when climate meets finance. Thank you all very much. Thanks to our guests, Stine Engen, Kristin Asdal, and Justin Leifso.
Thank you so much.
No, thanks for joining us, all of you. It's a great conversation. And you've been listening to, or maybe watching, Cultural Economy in the Kitchen from the Journal of Cultural Economy Editorial Collective. Today's episode was produced by C-Ross Cinematics, and you'll find links to the papers at the end of the video if you're watching on YouTube. And don't forget to like and subscribe, tell your friends, and share. Thanks so much.
And don't forget to join us next time.